Here is part one of your story, rewritten in a gripping, simple, and atmospheric style for a 20-minute YouTube narration aimed at an American audience. This version is ideal for voiceover with dramatic visuals and dark ambient music. Title: The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 1, Mother Sullivan's Secret. In the spring of 1834, deep in the rolling hills of central Virginia, a discovery was made, one that would haunt the state forever. It started with a farmhouse, just a simple two-story wooden house sitting quietly outside a town called Millbrook. But what authorities found beneath that house would shatter any idea of peace or innocence in the quiet countryside. 47 children, chained, locked in the cold, damp basement. Some were as young as 6, none older than 16. They spoke different languages, had different skin tones, different hair. Some were crying, some were too weak to cry. But when the sheriff asked them their names, each child whispered the same name through trembling lips: Mother Sullivan. A case forgotten. What happened at that farmhouse was so disturbing that 3 of the first officers to investigate quit within a week. Their report, so full of horror that it was sealed away, was buried in the Henrico County archives for more than 100 years. But let's be clear, this isn't just a story about children in chains. It's about deception. It's about how evil can wear a smile and call itself a mother, and how a small town turned a blind eye for over 2 decades. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone. It's for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of our history. If you've made it this far, you're different. You understand that some truths, no matter how horrifying, can't be ignored. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment. What state are you listening from? Are you ready to hear stories like this from your own backyard? Because this one started in the heart of Virginia, in a town that seemed too small, too tight-knit to hide such horror. But it did. Millbrook, Virginia, 1834. Back in 1834, Virginia was caught between the past and the future. The old plantation ways still ruled, but whispers of change were drifting in from the industrial north. Millbrook was small, maybe 50 families. Folks farmed corn and tobacco. They traded at Henderson's general store and held socials in the one-room schoolhouse. It was quiet, friendly, ordinary. The Sullivan farm sat just outside town, about 200 acres, a white wooden house with a wraparound porch, a red barn, a chicken coop, and a smokehouse. From the road it looked like every other farm, but it wasn't. That house had a basement unlike any other in Virginia. Bigger, deeper, hidden, and that's where the children were kept. The Sullivans. Ezra Sullivan bought the land in 1809 using money from his father's tobacco fortune. He hired workers over the years to dig, expand, and build underneath the house, but he never let anyone see the full project. He paid in cash, told them to stay in their assigned area. No one asked questions. Why would they? Ezra was polite. Private, sure, but not strange. His wife, Constance, arrived in 1811. She was 22, with dark hair and a soft voice. Neighbours said she was always neat, always gentle. She went to church when she felt well enough and was known for helping the less fortunate. When people asked about the children they sometimes saw around the farm, Constance had a ready answer. They were orphans, she said, from her family in Pennsylvania. She and Ezra were caring for them until good homes could be found. Everyone believed her. Strange signs ignored. Mrs. Henderson at the general store remembered seeing little faces peeking from the back of the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to shop. The children never spoke. Constance would smile and say they were shy, traumatized, needed time to heal. She bought a lot of food: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, medicines too. Enough for a dozen mouths, not 2. When Mr. Henderson asked about it, she just said, "Children eat a lot, and sick ones eat more." No one pushed further. The Sullivans worked late. Lights in the farmhouse burned long after the neighbours went to sleep. Some said they heard hammering, even saw smoke from the chimney at midnight. Ezra told them he was making more room for the children. The doctor and the pastor, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the travelling physician, was called to the farm a few times over the years. Constance would meet him at the door, explain that one of the orphans was sick. But he was never allowed to see the child. "They're scared of men," she would say. "They've suffered enough." She gave the symptoms, asked for medicine. He always gave it. Even Reverend Samuel Matthews, the local pastor, believed in the Sullivans. He thought they were doing God's work, caring for the forgotten, the lost. He offered help, tried to place the children in homes. But Constance always had an answer. I'm in touch with relatives. We're just waiting for the right arrangements. 20 years of waiting. 20 years of lies. The winter that changed everything. In February 1834, Virginia was hit with one of the harshest winters in memory. Temperatures dropped. Snow buried the hills. The roads turned to ice. On the night of February 23rd, a travelling merchant named Jacob Stern was caught in a blizzard while heading from Richmond to Charlottesville. He saw the Sullivan farmhouse glowing in the distance, one of the only lights for miles. He knocked. Ezra opened the door, clearly reluctant, but he couldn't turn away a man in need. Not in that weather. Stern later described the house as tense, uncomfortable. He said Constance was polite but stiff. The house was warm, the food was plain but filling, but something felt off. Ezra was jumpy, kept checking the windows, wouldn't let Stern go downstairs to fetch wood or use the cellar. And then Stern heard something from beneath the floorboards, a sound like crying. He thought it might have been the wind. He told himself it had to be the wind. To be continued? Part 2 of your dark mystery horror series, rewritten in simple, gripping and detailed language, perfect for a 20-minute YouTube narration for an American audience. Title, The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 2, The Cellar Door. The night of February 23rd, 1834 started like any other winter evening. Cold, silent. A thick blanket of snow covered the Virginia hills and the roads had turned dangerous. That's when Jacob Stern, a travelling merchant from Richmond, found himself stranded in the storm. The only light he could see came from a farmhouse on a distant hill, the Sullivan farm. A strange dinner. Ezra Sullivan opened the door with hesitation. Behind him, Constance stood, her expression tight, her eyes sharp. They offered Stern shelter. How could they not? In those days, turning away a traveller during a storm was unthinkable. Inside, the house was dim and overly quiet. Constance served a plain dinner of cornbread and salt pork. The meal was warm, but the atmosphere was not. The Sullivans barely spoke. They glanced at each other nervously, with every sound that came from outside or below. When Stern asked about the children he'd heard they cared for, Constance answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They're all asleep," she said softly. "They've been sick with fever. Best not to disturb them." Stern accepted the answer. What else could he do? But that night, as he lay on a makeshift bed in the parlour, he heard something he couldn't ignore. Muffled crying from beneath the floor. Just the wind. The next morning, when Stern brought it up, Ezra chuckled nervously. "Old house," he said. "Wind gets under the boards sometimes, makes strange noises, especially in this cold." Stern nodded, but the excuse didn't sit right with him. As he rode away later that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong inside that house. He wasn't the only one. The Irish girl who disappeared. 3 weeks later, on March 15th, another event pushed the dark secret closer to the surface. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant, was travelling with her family, seeking work in the tobacco fields near Richmond. During a river crossing, she got separated. Wet, cold, and alone as night fell, she saw the light from the Sullivan farmhouse and knocked on their door. Constance welcomed her in. She was never seen again. Her family searched for days, reporting her missing to the sheriff in Richmond. They described where she'd last been seen and the direction she was walking. A search party combed the woods, but the Virginia wilderness was vast and unforgiving. They gave up after a week. Mary Catherine Flynn was presumed dead, lost to the cold or attacked by wild animals, but she wasn't. The scream in the woods, April 2nd, 1834, just after sunset. Local farmer William Hutchinson was out hunting rabbits near the woods behind the Sullivan farm. He was a quiet man, not one to stir trouble, but what he heard that evening stopped him in his tracks. Children screaming, not playful shouts, not laughter, but pure, heart-stopping terror. The sound came from beneath the Sullivan house. Hutchinson crept closer, hiding behind oak trees. He listened for nearly an hour. The screams rose and fell, muffled but unmistakable. Then he saw Ezra Sullivan. Ezra stepped from a small door built into the side of the house, low to the ground, chained and padlocked. He looked around, nervous, before slipping back underground. Hutchinson ran straight home. The town starts to talk when Hutchinson told his neighbours. The town split in opinion. Some believed the children were simply troubled, maybe needing strict discipline. Others began to recall odd things they'd ignored for years. The enormous food orders Constance placed at the general store. The strange sounds late at night. The fact that not a single one of those orphans had ever been seen in town. It all started to add up. The law gets involved. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford had worked Henrico County for 15 years. He'd heard plenty of gossip in his day and didn't take much stock in wild stories. But when Hutchinson came to him in person and insisted on filing a formal complaint, Crawford was bound by law to investigate. On the morning of April 8, 1834, just after dawn, Sheriff Crawford and his deputy, Marcus Webb, rode out to the Sullivan farm. They expected a short, routine visit. They couldn't have been more wrong.
I'm a smile.
Constance met them at the door with her usual soft voice and calm manner. She invited them in, offered coffee, and expressed concern about the town's rumours. She explained, again, that they were caring for orphan children. She even showed the sheriff a bundle of letters, supposedly from relatives in Pennsylvania. Everything looked in order, until Deputy Webb excused himself to use the outhouse. As he rounded the side of the house, he saw it. The cellar door, secured with 3 padlocks, wrapped in thick iron chains. The wood around the handles was scratched and worn, as if someone inside had tried to claw their way out. Webb's stomach dropped. The cellar! He returned to the house and quietly told Sheriff Crawford what he saw. The sheriff, keeping his voice calm, asked Constance to show them the cellar. At that moment, everything changed. Constance froze. Her hands shook. Her voice faltered. "It's dangerous down there," she said. "We store old equipment. The children aren't allowed. There's nothing to see." And then they heard it, the sound of crying. Soft, weak, human, coming from beneath their feet. The officers pushed past her. What they found. The stench hit them first, a foking mix of human waste, rot, and something worse, despair. The basement, expanded over 2 decades by Ezra Sullivan, was no ordinary root cellar. It was massive, an underground maze of stone walls and hidden rooms designed to muffle sound, designed to trap. The main chamber was directly beneath the kitchen, and it was full of children. The prison below. 47 children, ages 6 to 16, chained to the stone walls, shackled by the ankles, barely clothed, emaciated, sick. They didn't cry out at first, they just stared. Blank, hollow. Deputy Webber, father of 4, ran back upstairs and vomited, twice. Sheriff Crawford stood frozen, trying to understand what he was seeing. It wasn't just the number of children, it was the system. The cold, calculated way the entire thing had been built.
The truth
comes out. In smaller rooms they found more horrors. A punishment room with restraints and stocks. A makeshift medical area with crude tools, used not to heal, but to keep the children alive. And a record room. Dozens of ledgers. Detailed logs with names, ages, where each child came from when they arrived, and notes on behaviour and condition. The first entries dated back to 1812. The children had come from everywhere. Poorhouses, orphanages, even the streets. Some were purchased, others kidnapped. Others still had simply disappeared during travel, like Mary Catherine Flynn. The records revealed the full scale. More than 90 children had passed through the Sullivan basement, but there were only 47 alive. The question everyone feared to ask: what happened to the others? The hidden chamber. The answer was found in the darkest corner of the basement. A narrow tunnel, low enough that the officers had to crawl through it. And there, in a hidden chamber, they found the graves. 36 children, buried in shallow pits. Some had clearly died of illness or starvation. Others had injuries, bruised skulls, broken bones. Their tiny bodies were covered with lime, a desperate attempt to mask the smell.
A town in shock.
The investigation would go on for months. How had no one noticed? The answer was chillingly simple. Constance Sullivan knew how to manipulate. She knew how to lie with a smile. She understood how people wanted to believe the best, and she used that trust to build a world of horror hidden just below their feet. Of your dark mystery horror YouTube series, rewritten in clear, atmospheric, and compelling storytelling style for a 20-minute video. The language is simple and designed to hook an American audience. Title: The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 3, The Woman Behind the Mask. Constance Sullivan wasn't just a woman living on a quiet Virginia farm. She was something else entirely. To the town of Millbrook, she was a devoted Christian wife, a soft-spoken woman who took in orphaned children and gave them a place to rest and recover. But that image, the kind woman with the gentle smile, was a carefully built lie. Constance had crafted a persona so perfect, so convincing, that no one ever looked too closely, and that's exactly how she wanted it. The mask of motherhood. She understood the world she lived in. In a rural 1830s Virginia community, people respected those who claimed to live by Christian values. A woman who cared for children, who fed the hungry and attended church when she was able, that kind of person earned trust easily. But that trust became a shield. She explained away the strange things with ease. Why weren't the children seen in town? They're sick, too traumatized to be around strangers. Why did they never leave? I'm arranging homes with distant family in Pennsylvania. Why did they call her mother? Because I treat them like my own. It all sounded so noble. No one questioned the large amounts of food she bought or the medicine, or why no one ever heard laughter from those children. Only silence. A system of deception. But Constance's operation wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was a well-oiled machine. She had created layers of protection. The children were told to call her mother, and they were punished if they didn't. If someone ever overheard them or caught a glimpse of them, it would seem like they were just part of a big, quiet family. Outsiders only saw brief flashes of these children, always coached to stay silent, to look down, to act shy. Their silence was mistaken for grief. No one realized it was fear. Even the basement had been carefully designed. It had been built over many years, in small pieces, by different workers who were never told the full picture. Each man handled one part of the job. No one knew the whole layout. No one but the Sullivans. The soundproof walls ensured no one outside could hear what was happening beneath their feet. And when people did hear something strange, just the kids playing, old pipes, wind under the floorboards.
Psychological chains!
But the most disturbing part wasn't the chains around the children's ankles. It was the chains around their minds. From the moment they arrived, Constance told them they were unwanted, that their families had given them away, that no one was coming, that the outside world was worse than the one they were in. Some children believed her. Others resisted at first, but those who fought back were punished in front of the others. Isolation, withholding food, public beatings by Ezra. It didn't take long for fear to take root. Constance used rewards too. The children who obeyed were given more food, extra blankets, or a little time without chains. She created a prison where the inmates policed each other, and most tragically, many of the children accepted their fate, not because they wanted to, but because they no longer believed they had any choice. The town in denial. When news of the basement broke, the town of Millbrook didn't believe it at first. How could it be true, they asked. She was so kind, so devoted to helping others. Some blamed Ezra, others said it had to be a misunderstanding, but those excuses vanished quickly because what the sheriff found next shattered every illusion. Cracking the code. In the basement's record room, authorities discovered something chilling. Letters. Dozens of them. Correspondence between Constance Sullivan and criminal contacts across several states. They weren't just caring for orphans, they were trafficking children. Buying, selling, trading, the letters used coded language, merchandise, deliveries, quality control. But once investigators cracked the simple cipher, the truth was clear. One letter, dated just months before the farm's discovery, came from someone signing as A. Morrison in Philadelphia. It read, "I have 6 new items. Ages and conditions vary. Temperament notes included. Please advise which are suitable for your needs." Each item was a child. Their personalities were listed like cattle: obedient, aggressive, fearful, broken. It was a catalogue of suffering, a web of horror. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, now leading the investigation, uncovered letters from at least 12 people across 5 states, all involved in similar operations. And the Sullivans weren't just buying children, they were selling them too. Financial records showed Constance had paid between $50 and $200 per child, depending on age, condition, and behaviour. She'd made over $8,000 in those 2 decades, a fortune at the time, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. This wasn't just a crime, it was an industry, and the Sullivan farm had been a hub. Clues hidden in plain sight. As the investigation grew, more local people began to realise they'd seen pieces of the puzzle years ago. Thomas Henderson, the general store owner, found old receipts. He'd sold Constance unusual quantities of supplies. Dozens of blankets, bulk children's medicine and clothing in all sizes. At the time it seemed charitable, now it seemed sinister. Even Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the travelling physician, admitted that Constance had often requested very specific treatments. Malnutrition formulas, medicines for infected wounds, and most chillingly, sedatives. She never let him examine the children, but she asked all the right questions. Constance wasn't just a monster, she was a student of survival science. Her goal wasn't to help the children, her goal was to keep them alive, just enough to be sold. Ezra Sullivan, the enforcer. While Constance ran the operation with charm and control, Ezra did the dirty work. The surviving children described him as the enforcer, the one who delivered punishments, who built the restraints, who dragged them back when they tried to resist. He didn't speak much, but his silence was terrifying. Ezra was the hammer, Constance was the hand that held it. Uncovering the missing, among the most devastating discoveries were the ledgers, listing all the children who had come through the Sullivan basement. More than 90 names, but only 47 children had been rescued. The rest, some had been transferred to other farms. Others were marked unfit or damaged. Those matched the remains buried in shallow graves under the house. The worst part? This operation was growing. Recent letters discussed expanding, building similar basements in Georgia and South Carolina. The Sullivans were preparing to franchise their cruelty. A spark of hope. Rebecca. The breakthrough came from a survivor. Her name was Rebecca. She was around 14, with sharp eyes and a memory like a steel trap. She'd been taken from a farm in Pennsylvania when she was just 9, lured by a woman who said she was a distant cousin, promised candy and a wagon ride. She woke up in chains, but Rebecca never gave up. Over 5 long years, she memorized everything. The faces of the visitors, the conversations she overheard, the names of places and people. Unlike the others, she listened and she remembered. The big Rebecca told investigators about other farms, other locations just like the Sullivan property. She remembered one man from Charleston, another from Savannah. She described conversations about moving shipments and preparing new holding rooms. Her memories became a map, and for the first time, law enforcement saw the full scope of what they were up against. This wasn't one woman, one farm. It was a network, a system. A hidden world of child trafficking operating in plain sight, under the noses of good people who never imagined it could happen. Here is part 4 of your dark mystery horror YouTube series. Title: The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 4, The Hidden Network. Some monsters wear masks, others wear bonnets and aprons, but the worst ones hide in plain sight, protected by distance, silence, and fear. By the spring of 1834, it was clear to Sheriff Crawford and his team that the Sullivan case was no isolated crime. It was part of something much, much bigger. And now, thanks to the testimony of one Rebecca, that larger network was beginning to come into focus. Rebecca's memory, a map of horror. Rebecca had spent 5 years in the Sullivan basement. She had witnessed more than most adults could survive. But unlike the other children, she had never fully broken. She watched, she listened, and she remembered everything. The names of people who came and went, the strange symbols on crates, the accents, the smells, the whispered plans behind closed doors. Rebecca described a man called Mr. Ellis, who visited once a year from Georgia. Another man with a crooked eye from Baltimore. She remembered a woman named Miss Clara who wore too much perfume and always brought new children in the back of a covered wagon. Rebecca even remembered hearing Constance talk about a house in Wilmington, North Carolina. where the weaker ones were sent if they couldn't be sold. Thanks to her, the spiderweb was finally visible. The network expands. Sheriff Crawford sent letters to law enforcement officials across several states. At first, the replies were slow, but as details began to line up, names, dates, disappearances, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. It turned out that dozens of children had vanished under similar circumstances across Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Children no one ever found. Until now. In late April 1834, a break came when a sheriff in Fayetteville, North Carolina, reported a property with similar suspicious activity. A small tobacco farm owned by a quiet older couple had been making large, unexplained supply purchases. Neighbors had heard strange noises at night. The property was raided. Inside a concealed cellar, authorities found 11 children, chained and malnourished, just like the ones found on the Sullivan farm. The operation was real and spreading federal attention. The case had now grown too large for local authorities alone. In early May, US Marshals were brought in, an unprecedented step at the time. Back in 1834, federal law enforcement rarely crossed state lines, but the Sullivan network had left them no choice. It was in every sense an early version of interstate human trafficking. What they found was horrifying. Letters from Constance Sullivan matched those found at the North Carolina site. A second set of coded correspondence revealed contact with at least 4 additional sites still unknown. The marshals began using Rebecca's testimony to track known names and aliases across the East Coast. A national manhunt began, quietly, because the public still didn't know the full story. Authorities feared mass panic if the truth came out too quickly. Newspapers reported illegal orphan trades and child labor rings, but they didn't describe the chains, the cells, the buried bodies, but the investigation rolled on. Unlikely helpers. Not everyone wanted to believe the truth. Even with mounting evidence, some in Millbrook still insisted that Constance had been manipulated or mentally ill. But others, braver souls, offered help. Dr. Whitfield, the travelling physician, joined the investigation full-time. He offered insight into the medical records and cross-referenced medicine requests from nearby towns. This led to a surprising discovery. Similar medical orders had been placed under false names in Fredericksburg, VA and Charleston, SC. Same list of supplies, same quantities, same pattern. Using this, marshals identified another suspect, a woman named Judith Crane, living on a plantation outside Charleston. She had once corresponded with Constance, using the same coded language. Another raid followed. 6 more children were rescued. The survivors speak. Back in Henrico County, the rescued children were slowly beginning to speak. Some took weeks, others took months, but one by one they started telling their stories. They described how newcomers were kept in isolation, how they were stripped of names, of hope, of identity, how older children were used to control younger ones, how they were punished for speaking, for crying, even for dreaming out loud. One boy, around 10 years old, whispered, "She said the world forgot us, and she was right, no one came." That line haunted every investigator, because it was true, until now, Ezra's final days. Ezra Sullivan had been arrested shortly after the basement was discovered. At first, he refused to talk. He just sat in his cell, silent. But when the bodies were found, the shallow graves under his own floor, he cracked. He claimed he was only doing what Constance told him to do, that he had built what she designed, that he just wanted to be left alone. But then, late one night, Ezra hanged himself in his jail cell with a torn strip of his blanket. He left no note, no apology, no answers, only silence. Constance on trial. Unlike her husband, Constance Sullivan faced her crimes in court. Her trial began in August 1834 in Richmond, Virginia, and quickly became the most talked about legal proceeding in the region's history. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse every day. Some cursed her name. Others stared at her in disbelief, unable to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the monster described in testimony. Constance sat quietly through it all, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes rarely moved. She offered no up nothing. She simply said, "I did what was necessary. No one else would take them." The courtroom fell silent. Then the evidence was read. child by child, letter by letter, photograph by sketch, grave by grave. The jury took less than 2 hours to return a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. But before the execution could be carried out, Constance fell ill in prison. Some say it was a fever. Others whispered it was poison. She died on October 17th, 1834, in her cell. The aftermath. After her death, officials continued to investigate leads uncovered in Rebecca's testimony. Over the next 2 years, 7 more sites were discovered. In total, 143 children were rescued from various parts of the operation. Many could not remember their real names. Some were reunited with family. Others never were. Some were sent to newly established homes in Richmond and Baltimore, where volunteers and doctors worked to rehabilitate them. The records from the Sullivan farm became the backbone of new child protection laws in Virginia and later the nation. In 1836, Congress passed the Child Protection and Recovery Act, the first law of its kind to allow federal officers to investigate the disappearance of minors across state lines. The children remember. Some of the children rescued from the Sullivan basement grew into adults who never spoke of what happened. Others became advocates, writers, or teachers, but they never forgot. And in 1850, 16 years after the horror was discovered, a small plaque was placed near the ruins of the Sullivan farmhouse. It reads, "In memory of the forgotten children, may silence never protect evil again."
To be continued.
In part 5, we dive into the other locations uncovered through the Sullivan network and the strange and horrifying similarities they share. Mystery horror YouTube series. Title: The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 5, The Other Houses. Evil doesn't always end when one monster dies. Sometimes it just moves. When Constance Sullivan died in her prison cell in 1834, most of the community thought the nightmare was over. They were wrong, because what started under one farmhouse in Virginia had already spread. And even with Constance gone, the network she helped build, a secret trafficking system that crossed state lines, was still alive. A map written in memory. After Constance's death, the only person who truly understood the scale of the operation was not a marshal or a sheriff. It was a 14-year-old girl. Rebecca, the survivor whose memories had already led to 2 successful raids, was now working directly with federal marshals. She drew crude maps of farm roads, remembered names mentioned only once, and described the sound of a river heard through the floorboards at one location. From her information alone, 3 more sites were identified. 1, a former tobacco curing shed in western North Carolina. 2, a barn near Fredericksburg, Virginia. 3, a boarding house in rural Georgia. Each place carried the same horrifying signature: hidden basements, soundproof walls, chained children. And each one revealed a little more about how deeply this criminal web had spread. Site 1, the River Shed. The first location was near the banks of the French Broad River in North Carolina. What looked like a rundown farm building was actually a concealed prison. Neighbors had dismissed the property as abandoned, though they remembered strange wagon deliveries in the middle of the night. When marshals raided the shed, they found 9 children inside. But something was different here. Instead of being held in chains, the children were confined in small rooms with barred windows and locked doors. They had been taught strict routines: wake up, clean, eat, stay silent. There was no punishment room, no visible bruises. Instead, they were controlled by fear. One boy whispered to an officer, "If we scream, they send us to the place with no light for days." That place was a root cellar below the riverline. Damp, cold, pitch black. Just like the Sullivan basement, but cruel in a new way. Site 2, the Fredericksburg barn. The second location was discovered almost by accident. An officer recognized from Rebecca's memory, Judge Arlen Banks, a retired magistrate who had quietly purchased a barn on the outskirts of Fredericksburg in 1830. He was known as a quiet, wealthy man who claimed to raise specialty crops. But when questioned, he became nervous. A raid followed. What they found was worse than expected. The barn had a double false floor beneath which lay a long stone tunnel. At the end of the tunnel was a holding cell, empty, except for 3 filthy mattresses and a locked cabinet full of children's shoes. A second, hidden room held ledgers, dozens of names, initials, and transaction records matching ones from the Sullivan case. The barn hadn't held children in over a year, but it had once. And the records showed that 12 children had passed through that site in total. None had been accounted for. Site 3, the Georgia boarding house. The third site was in LaGrange, Georgia, a peaceful town at the edge of the forest. The location was disguised as a women's boarding house operated by a woman known as Miss Clara, a name Rebecca had mentioned. Miss Clara was everything Constance had been: warm, polite, charitable. Locals adored her. She housed troubled girls, helped with sewing lessons, and hosted weekly Bible readings. But behind the charm was a locked back room with reinforced walls. When officers searched the home, they found 6 girls, all under the age of 13, each wearing matching grey uniforms. They had been stripped of their names and given numbers. Number 4, real name Lottie, had been there the longest. She remembered being told that her parents had sold her, that she had no past, and that Clara had saved her from a life on the streets. When shown a photo of Rebecca, she said softly, "I know her. She used to cry at night when she thought no one was listening." The shared patterns. After these 3 raids, a disturbing trend became clear. All the locations had underground or hidden chambers, had access to rural roads that avoided main towns, operated under the mask of charity or religion, used record-keeping systems with coded language, had connections to Constance Sullivan. Even in death, her fingerprints were everywhere. But it went deeper. A secret ledger. At the Georgia site, marshals uncovered something they had never seen before: a master ledger. Inside were entries tracking over 200 children across 8 locations. Each entry had the following: a date, an origin, usually a city or poorhouse, a destination, a condition grade A, B, C, or D, a price. But some entries had no price, only the word undesirable. Those matched the children who had died. The document ended with a chilling phrase at the bottom: "Order always restores purpose. Expand but stay unseen." It was initialed CS. A fragments of resistance. Even as this darkness spread, there were glimpses of courage. In LaGrange, Georgia, a schoolteacher named Eliza Monroe had quietly tried to investigate the boarding house. She'd noticed bruises on one of the girls, but every time she asked questions, Miss Clara deflected. Eliza had written a letter to the mayor, but it was dismissed. Now, with the truth revealed, Eliza became a local hero and one of the first civilians to join a federal task group focused on uncovering hidden sites across the South. A movement had begun. Whispers of what was happening were reaching the ears of church leaders, schoolmasters, and even small-town judges. Some tried to help. Others were part of the cover-up. But the silence was breaking. The growing web. Rebecca's testimony, paired with the Georgia ledger, gave federal marshals their first full list of suspected sites. By the end of 1835, they had identified a blacksmith shop in eastern Tennessee, a coastal warehouse in Charleston, an abandoned hotel in Maryland, a slave ship retrofitted for child transport along the Potomac. Each location required time, planning, and secrecy to investigate, and time was running out for the children still trapped inside. Broken but not forgotten. By the start of 1836, 89 more children had been rescued. Some were reunited with family. Some never remembered where they came from. But all of them carried the same mark: silence, fear, and wide, watchful eyes. They had survived something most people couldn't imagine. Some drew pictures of their prison cells. Others spoke only at night under blankets in whispers. But every story added a piece to the puzzle. And every voice helped stop the next monster. YouTube series. The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 6, The Buyers. We often ask who commits the crime, but the more dangerous question is who pays for it. By the spring of 1836, the investigators had uncovered over a dozen hidden sites, more than 200 rescued children, and clear evidence of a multi-state trafficking network. But one question remained. Why? Why were these children being taken? Who was receiving them, and what was happening to those marked delivered? The answers would reveal a world far darker than anyone had imagined, because behind every cage there was someone holding a key, and behind every missing child someone was paying. The ledger's hidden code. In the Georgia boarding house, investigators had found a master ledger, coded and precise. At first, they thought the entries only tracked the children, names, origins, grades, and destinations. But tucked near the back were a few pages written in a different hand. The writing was smaller, sharper, and colder. Instead of names of children, these pages listed locations, dates, and initials. Next to each entry, an amount of money and the word fulfilled. One such entry read Baltimore 1833 JH 2 units, $300 fulfilled. Another said Savannah 1834 AF 1 unit, age 10 compliant, $180 fulfilled. Investigators began cross-referencing those initials with known citizens, landowners, merchants, and even clergymen. The list that emerged was shocking. Not criminals, not drifters, but respected members of society. Judges, doctors, businessmen, even a state senator. These were the buyers, and they had been hiding in plain sight. The darkness behind closed doors. For months, authorities worked in secret to identify and observe the people listed in the buyer's ledger. They discovered a horrifying pattern. The children weren't always kept at the delivery locations permanently. Some were moved again, some disappeared without a trace. But in a few cases, survivors were found, held in private rooms, back buildings, or disguised as household servants. One raid in Alexandria, Virginia recovered 2 girls being held in the home of a retired Navy officer. He claimed he was rescuing the girls from poverty. But medical exams told a different story. Years of malnutrition, broken bones, and silence. He was arrested. Another location was a plantation outside Charleston, where 3 boys had been forced to work in hidden quarters far from the other field hands. The plantation owner was a member of a local church, praised for his generosity toward orphans. He too was arrested, but in many cases there was no one to arrest because the children were gone, sold again, or dead. A whispered market. The deeper marshals dug, the clearer the picture became. There was no single buyer. There was a market, quiet, private, selective. Buyers paid based on age, condition, obedience, and most disturbingly, personal preference. Letters uncovered in several locations revealed coded requests that made investigators sick. One note said, "I require a silent girl, no older than 8, blonde preferred, clean." Another asked, "The last one was too fearful. Send one that's more broken in." Some requests were denied, others were fulfilled. The children were not treated as people, they were treated as products. Rebecca speaks again. Rebecca, the brave survivor who had helped expose the network, was brought in once more. She recognized several names on the buyer list, not just from conversations, but from actual visits. One man, she said, wore a ring with a black stone and carried licorice in his coat pocket. He had visited twice, shopping, as Constance had called it. He never looked the children in the eye. Another visitor was a woman. Rebecca remembered her perfume, lavender and decay. She picked a girl named Elsie. Rebecca never saw Elsie again. Victims recovered through raids and anonymous tips. 27 additional children were recovered from the buyer's side of the network between 1836 and 1837. Some had been held for months, others for years. One girl in Georgia was found living in a crawl space beneath her buyer's home, fed once a day, used for chores, never allowed to speak. One boy, now nearly 17, had been passed between 4 households since the age of 9. He no longer remembered his original name. Some victims were forced into hard labor, others into worse. One rescued girl simply said, "They didn't want me to die, but they didn't want me to live either." The system protects itself. Bringing the buyers to justice proved harder than anyone expected. Many were wealthy, connected. Some denied everything and called the children liars. Some judges threw out charges due to lack of evidence, even when ledgers clearly showed the transactions. In one case, a buyer admitted his role, but claimed he thought it was legal, as the children were orphans and already unwanted. His case never went to trial. But public pressure was growing. The truth had begun leaking to newspapers and people were furious. The public finds out. In August 1837, an exposé in the Richmond Daily Gazette revealed the full story. The Sullivan basement, the hidden houses, the ledger, the buyers. The article titled "The Children Who Never Spoke" stunned the country. Letters flooded into Washington. Citizens demanded justice. A movement was born, one that insisted child welfare be protected by law, not left to whispers and luck. In response, Congress began drafting new legislation. The Sullivan case had become more than a local horror. It was now a national awakening. Resistance and reform. Still, not everyone supported the investigation. Some towns refused to believe their leaders were guilty. In Charleston, protesters defended a church elder accused of buying 2 boys. In Savannah, a local judge dismissed evidence as emotional nonsense. But the tide was turning. Newspapers, preachers, and community leaders began speaking up. They reminded the public that these were children, that silence was no longer an option, that pretending it wasn't happening wouldn't make it stop. And slowly, the system began to change. A law is born on April 3rd, 1838. After years of investigation, protest, and heartbreak, the US government passed the Child Protection and Transport Act. It made the interstate trafficking of minors a federal crime. It gave marshals the power to cross state lines. It required mandatory registration of orphanages and child labour sites. And it funded the first generation of what we'd now call child welfare agents. The law was born from blood and silence, but it meant the children would no longer be alone. Final notes from the Ledger investigators continue to analyse every page of the Sullivan documents. One entry near the back, undated, simply read, "When people stop asking questions, we can begin again." That chilling line was a reminder that even with Constance and Ezra gone, even with laws passed and children rescued, the threat wasn't over. It never truly ends. But now, at least, the silence had been broken. To be continued. In Part 7, we turn our focus to the survivors, the children who lived through the unimaginable and what became of them in the years that followed. Some vanished into quiet lives, some rose up and demanded the world never forget. And one of them would come face to face with someone from the network again. Of your YouTube dark mystery horror series. Title: The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 7, The Survivors. They were broken, forgotten, and left in the dark. But they lived, and their stories didn't end in the basement. When the Sullivan Network was uncovered in the 1830s, over 200 children were rescued from a nightmare no one had believed possible. But what happened next? How do you rebuild a life when it was stolen before it even began? This is the story of the survivors, the boys and girls who escaped the darkness under the farmhouse and the scars they carried into adulthood, because some of them became quiet ghosts, disappearing from public life, and some refused to stay silent. The hardest question. The truth is, no one knew what to do with the children at first. There were no counselling programs, no long-term care facilities, no official system to help them. Some were sent to local orphanages, some were taken in by churches, others were sent back to family members, many of whom had already assumed the child was dead. And in far too many cases, the trauma had changed them so deeply it was hard to recognise the child who had once been there. The girl who remembered Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl who helped break the case, was placed under the protection of federal marshals. She was offered a new name and a quiet life in Ohio, but she refused. She chose instead to testify, again and again, against not only the Sullivan family, but the buyers, the transporters, and even judges who had turned a blind eye. At just 16, she stood in a courtroom and said, "They tried to erase us, but we are still here, and we remember everything." Her bravery became legendary. She was interviewed by newspapers, written about in pamphlets, and used her voice to push for federal protection laws for children. Rebecca never married, she never disappeared. She became an early voice for what we would now call victims' rights. The boy from the river Shed, one boy Samuel, had been held in the North Carolina River Shed for 5 years. He was rescued at age 12, angry, silent, and violent. He bit one of the doctors during treatment. But under the care of a widowed school teacher in Virginia, Samuel slowly began to speak again. His first full sentence was, "I don't hear the screaming anymore." Samuel later became a blacksmith. He never sought attention, but he forged a small iron medallion for every child who had survived, shaped like the door lock that had once held him captive. He called it the Unbroken Circle. Lottie's second life, Lottie, rescued from the Georgia boarding house, had forgotten her real name by the time she was found. She only knew herself as Number 4. At age 11, she was taken in by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania. They renamed her Charlotte Ann and taught her to write again. She eventually became a teacher, working at a school for orphans in Baltimore. She never spoke publicly about her past until one afternoon in 1871, when a student asked her why she always locked the classroom windows. She stared for a long time before answering, because sometimes monsters wear aprons and smile while they feed you. After that, she began writing everything down, a diary over 200 pages long that now sits in the Library of Congress. The ones who disappeared, not every survivor found healing. Some ran away from their new homes. Some ended up in poorhouses, jails, or dead before 20. The trauma was too deep, too tangled. They couldn't connect with others. They feared closed doors. They woke up screaming. Their names faded from public records, but their stories lived on in the nightmares of those who had seen what happened beneath that farmhouse. The survivor who returned in 1849, 15 years after the Sullivan discovery, a young man named Thomas Abel, walked back into Millbrook, Virginia. He had been only 8 when he was rescued. Now he was 23, tall, quiet, and haunted. But he had come for a reason. The Sullivan farmhouse was still standing. After the trial, the property had been auctioned off and a new family moved in. They'd sealed the basement and never reopened it. But rumours remained. Locals said they still heard crying sometimes when the wind blew through the trees. Thomas walked up to the house, knocked on the door, and introduced himself as someone who had once lived beneath their floor. The family gave him permission to walk the grounds. He spent 6 hours there, alone. Before leaving, he carved a message into the side of the old cellar door. We were here, and now we are free. He never returned again. A memorial no one saw in 1852, a travelling preacher named Elias Gray passed through Henrico County. He had heard whispers of the Sullivan case and the children no one talked about anymore. He held a small service under the oak trees behind the farmhouse. No one attended. No one even knew it happened, but in his journal he wrote, "I read their names, as many as I could find, into the open wind, for if the world forgets them, then evil has truly won." That patch of land became an unofficial memorial. To this day, visitors still leave small stones, buttons, or iron rings beneath that tree. What became of the Sullivan name? Ezra died in custody shortly after Constance. They had no known children of their own. But their name lived on, not in bloodlines, but in fear. For decades after, parents in rural Virginia warned their children, "Be good, or Mother Sullivan will come for you." She became a boogeyman, a name whispered by candlelight. But those who knew the truth didn't speak her name at all. They remembered the sound of chains, the taste of mouldy bread, the absence of sunlight, and they remembered one another. Reunion in silence. In 1865, after the Civil War, a small gathering was held in Richmond. It wasn't publicised. There were no speeches, just 17 adults sitting in a circle, most of them in their 30s and 40s. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't carry signs, they just sat and remembered. Many had never spoken to each other before, but when one man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small iron medallion, the others quietly did the same. The unbroken circle. They were children once. And now they had become the keepers of the story, so the world would never forget. To be of your dark mystery horror YouTube series. Title: The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 8, The Roots That Remain. Some stories end with justice, some end with silence, but the worst ones keep going. It had been more than 30 years since the basement beneath the Sullivan farmhouse was exposed. Most of the original investigators had passed on. The farmhouse had long since been torn down, but in the spring of 1867, a name appeared on a shipping manifest in Charleston, South Carolina, that stopped an old marshal in his tracks. The name was one he hadn't heard in decades, E. Sullivan, and below that, the words, "Livestock, 7 units," but there were no animals on that train. A familiar pattern marshal, Thomas Burnell, one of the last living agents who had worked the Sullivan investigation in the 1830s, was living quietly in Kentucky when he received a letter from a former colleague in Charleston. The letter was brief. Sullivan name, rail manifest, code similar to 34 ledger. You'll want to see this. Burnell hadn't touched the Sullivan files in years. He had nightmares even now of stone walls, chains, and silence. But he boarded the next train south because he knew something others didn't. E. Sullivan wasn't a mistake. The evil hadn't died with Constance. It had only gone to sleep. The Charleston house Burnell's investigation led him to a 2-story brick building on the edge of Charleston's shipping district. It was registered as a textile warehouse owned by Eleanor Sullivan, a woman in her late 30s with no children, no husband, and no public history. Neighbours described her as polite, quiet, and deeply involved in charity work. Sound familiar? Burnell nearly laughed when he heard it. It was Constance all over again. Inside the warehouse, Burnell visited the warehouse posing as a railway inspector. He expected a modest operation. What he found was a system, a mirror of the Sullivan farm, only modernised. The back of the warehouse had a staircase that led underground, not to a simple storage room, but to a reinforced basement with 5 locked doors. Behind one, a room with bunk cots. Another, shelves lined with basic medicines and clothes. And another, empty chains. A name resurfaces. Burnell called for backup, and within 48 hours, marshals raided the property. They found 6 children, all under the age of 12. 3 spoke no English. 1 refused to speak at all. The others told a familiar story. They had been taken from workhouses, orphanages, and city streets, promised a better life, and then disappeared. In one child's pocket was a metal button shaped like a circle. It matched the medallions once made by Samuel, the survivor blacksmith from Part 7. Someone was still using the unbroken circle symbol, but this time as bait. Who was Eleanor? Eleanor Sullivan wasn't in any census record before 1861. No birth certificate, no school history. She claimed to be Ezra's niece, but no documents confirmed it. What investigators discovered next was deeply unsettling. Eleanor was born in 1829, the same year that Rebecca had been taken. That meant she would have been around 5 years old when Constance Sullivan was active. And yet, there was no record of her ever being a prisoner. No survivor recalled her. No ledger mentioned her. But in Eleanor's hidden bedroom was a box. Inside, letters written in Constance Sullivan's own handwriting. The letters were instructional, like lessons. They included phrases like, "You must be the voice they trust. Feed them just enough to live, and never let them see the sky." Eleanor hadn't just continued the work. She had been trained. A second generation of horror. The Charleston warehouse wasn't the only site. Within months, investigators found 3 more properties in Georgia, Alabama, and Western Virginia. Each location had similar layouts, disguised as businesses or boarding houses, with basements built to hide lives. The second network had been smaller than the first, but its methods were even more precise. One site had soundproof walls, rationing logs, and coded intake forms. Another had a discipline room marked with painted numbers. Children were ranked by obedience, health, and compliance. The system had evolved. The broken chain. The biggest difference between this new network and Constance's? No buyers. There was no ledger of payments, no correspondence with customers. This time, the goal didn't seem to be trafficking. It was something else, something colder. The children were being kept for training, to be moulded into obedient workers, domestic servants, even messengers. One letter from Eleanor read, "If they're loyal, they survive. If not, they disappear." Investigators began to suspect the purpose was indoctrination, not just to sell children, but to raise them as invisible tools for powerful people. Rebecca's final message. When news of the Eleanor discovery reached newspapers, Rebecca, now in her 50s and living in Ohio, sent a public letter to the Richmond Evening Dispatch. Her message was clear. If the roots were not burned, then the tree still lives. She offered her help. Within weeks, Rebecca travelled south to meet with marshals and provide analysis of Eleanor's letters. She recognised many of the same phrases, tones, and manipulative tactics that Constance had used. But something about Eleanor was different, colder, calculated. Constance, in her twisted way, believed what she was doing was charity. Eleanor didn't believe anything. She was running a machine. A trial in shadows. In 1868, Eleanor Sullivan was brought to trial. But just like her predecessor, she never confessed. She spoke politely. She denied all knowledge. She claimed she was helping orphans and had been misunderstood. But one child, a 10-year-old boy named David, stood in the courtroom and pointed at her. His voice shook when he said, "She told us we were ghosts, that no one could hear us, but I heard the others crying. I remember." Eleanor was found guilty on 11 counts of child abduction and illegal confinement. She was sentenced to life in prison, but just 2 months after sentencing, she was found dead in her cell. Poison. No one ever discovered how it was smuggled in, but a note was found beside her body. It read, "The circle must stay closed." The Ghost Network. Even after Eleanor's death, investigators believed that others were still involved. Names found in her letters, abbreviations like HW and ML, had appeared in the 1834 Sullivan ledger too, which meant someone from the original operation had survived and helped build the second. One investigator called it the Ghost Network. No public face, no buyer lists, just shadow and silence. Legacy of the Forgotten. The Sullivan case, now spanning 2 generations, was used in 1872 to create one of the first federal child protection task forces. Marshals began actively monitoring orphanage records, property purchases, and basement construction permits across the eastern United States. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, because as Rebecca once said, as long as there are children without names, there will be those who try to take them. In Part 9, we step into the 20th century. A historian uncovers sealed documents in a Virginia courthouse basement that suggest the Sullivan Network may not have died after all. And something, or someone, may still be watching, because some secrets get passed down in blood. Would you like me to continue with 9 of your dark mystery horror YouTube series? Title, The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, Part 9, The Historian's Warning. Time forgets most things, but some things refuse to stay buried. In 1923, nearly 90 years after the children were found beneath the Sullivan farmhouse in Virginia, a young historian named Miles Kavanagh arrived in Henrico County to research forgotten American crimes. He thought he was looking for ghost stories, old folk legends, maybe faded court records. What he found in the courthouse basement was something else entirely. A sealed box, and inside that box were files marked Confidential Federal Review, with dates ranging from 1834 to 1908. The name on several folders? Sullivan. A curious discovery. Kavanagh was a professor from New York, writing a book on rural justice in the pre-Civil War South. He'd heard whispers of the Millbrook incident in an old newspaper clipping, and had come hoping to find a few lines for his introduction. Instead, the records clerk led him to a locked cabinet that hadn't been opened in over 40 years. The key had been misplaced, the clerk said, but the cabinet was marked, "Federal Hold, Do Not Destroy."
Kavanagh, ever the academic,
pulled out a crowbar and pried the drawer open. Inside was history no one had dared to publish.
No.
What the files revealed. The documents inside the box told a chilling tale. Court transcripts from 1834 to 1836, marshal reports from 1867 to 1870, but then a gap. From 1871 to 1902, there were only brief summaries. No names, no places, just coded references. Circle remains active in southern corridors. 2 unconfirmed facilities dismantled in 1886. Unknown female M appears to be coordinating movement. Then finally a typed report dated May 1908. It was from a federal agent based in Knoxville, Tennessee. The subject line read, "Third generation Sullivan activity confirmed." The Knoxville Orphan School. The 1908 report described a boarding school located just outside Knoxville called the Willowbrook Institute for Orphaned Girls. From the outside, it was a beautiful facility, brick buildings, flower gardens, smiling staff. But according to the report, several girls had recently escaped and alerted local authorities. They described locked dormitories at night, food withheld as punishment, correction rooms with straps and cold baths. and being told that they owed their lives to Mother Evelyn, investigators raided the school on May 19, 1908. They found 41 girls inside, all underfed, all terrified, and not one could say who had enrolled them. A familiar signature. Hidden in a locked desk drawer in Mother Evelyn's office was a leather-bound journal. In it, she referred to the girls by numbers, not names. She recorded their behavior, punishments, and emotional states. Some notes read, "No sound from 8, rewarded with an hour of fresh air. Number 19 tried to hide food, night confinement ordered. Nag 5 speaks of a dream about a cellar, curious." At the bottom of each page was a symbol, a hand-drawn circle with a single line through it. It matched the mark found in Constance Sullivan's original ledgers.
Who was Mother Evelyn? According to town records,
Mother Evelyn, real name Evelyn Moreau Sullivan, was born in Georgia in 1872. Her birth certificate was missing. She had no marriage records, no siblings, and no confirmed family ties. But in one letter, folded neatly inside her journal, was the phrase, "We carry the silence, from stone to brick we hold the line." Signed simply M, the same M mentioned in the 1871 report. This suggested Evelyn had been trained, not born into her role. The system wasn't just genetic, it was ritualistic. A torch passed in secret. The sealed aura. What troubled historian Miles Kavanagh the most? What came next? After 1908, all records stopped. Not just in Knoxville, but in federal reports across 5 states. No more sightings, no more raids, nothing. As if someone had shut the book complete, or made sure the pages were never written again. He found one final note at the bottom of a folder marked "Classified, internal use only." It read, "Recommend permanent seal on all Sullivan materials. Public knowledge poses threat to national morale." Signed, U.S. Department of Interior, Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI. Over the next year, Kavanagh compiled everything he found into a personal journal. He titled it The Unbroken Line. But every publisher turned him down. Too dark, too disturbing, too unbelievable. One editor wrote, "If any of this were true, we'd already know. You're chasing shadows." Kavanagh returned to New York in 1925. He taught quietly for another decade and then retired. But before he died in 1942, he donated his journal to a small historical society in Virginia, along with one chilling note. They never stopped, they just went deeper. The tape recorder incident. In 1971, a young graduate student named Nina Rhodes was cataloguing documents at that same Virginia Historical Society when she came across the journal. She read it cover to cover in a single night. The next morning, she returned with a portable tape recorder and began conducting interviews with local residents, asking if anyone remembered the Sullivan name. Most said no. One elderly woman said, "My daddy told me never to go near that old house, said they buried angels there." But one man, a former groundskeeper in Richmond, said something strange. "They used to come at night, cars with no plates. They picked up crates, not people. When asked what was in the crates, he replied, they screamed." The final page. As Nina dug deeper, she noticed something odd. Pages were missing from Kavanagh's original journal. 11 pages, torn cleanly, and taped to the inside of the back cover was a note in unfamiliar handwriting. "There is no end to this story. Only silence or exposure. Choose wisely. No signature, just the circle with the single line." What if it never stopped? To this day, no government agency has confirmed the existence of the Sullivan Network after 1908. No public memorials exist for the children rescued in Charleston, Knoxville, or Millbrook. But every few years, someone finds something. A forgotten ledger, a basement door with chains, a child who doesn't know their last name, and always, somewhere nearby, the circle. Not printed, not mass-produced. Carved, burned, stamped. As if left behind not just as a warning, but as a message. To be continued. In the final episode, part 10 of The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, we explore the terrifying theory that still haunts investigators to this day, that the Sullivan legacy didn't die out. It evolved into something far more hidden, far more organised, and far closer than we think. Final chapter, part 10 of your dark mystery horror YouTube series, titled The Children Beneath the Farmhouse, part 10, The Echoes Never Stop. What if the past was never buried? What if it just changed its face? Over a century has passed since the nightmare beneath the Sullivan farmhouse was first uncovered in 1834. Names have faded, records have vanished, but the echo of what happened never truly left. And now, in the digital age, a terrifying realization is beginning to form among those who've followed this story. It may not be over. Not even close. The digital clue. In 2019, a cybersecurity analyst named Kayla Monroe was reviewing deep web activity connected to missing persons forums. She wasn't looking for anything paranormal. Her job was to track suspicious chat rooms tied to human trafficking. But one user kept posting something strange. Every message ended with a simple circle with a line through it, the same mark found in the Sullivan ledgers, Eleanor's diary, and the Willowbrook journals. Kayla searched the symbol online, no matches, until she stumbled across a scanned page from a 1923 academic journal. At the bottom, scribbled faintly in pencil, "They never stopped, they just got smarter."
Signed, Miles Kavanagh.
A pattern resurfaces. Kayla became obsessed. She traced the symbol across 6 private message boards, each dedicated to lost children, urban legends, or unsolved historical cases. Every few months, a new post would appear. No name, no explanation, just GPS coordinates and the phrase, "You'll hear them if you listen long enough." In 2020, one of the coordinates led to an abandoned church outside Asheville, North Carolina. Inside the basement, investigators found 6 small beds, blankets, old food wrappers, a children's book, but no children. Whispers in the walls. In a podcast interview recorded that same year, a man named Jonas Bell, a demolition contractor from Maryland, described something chilling. "We were gutting an old estate up near Fredericksburg. There was a hidden room behind the kitchen pantry, brick sealed, took forever to knock down. Inside, they found 2 chairs, a rusted medical tray, and a child's shoe. On the far wall, the circle symbol. The place gave me chills. But the weirdest part," Jonas said, "the cement smelled fresh, like someone had been there not long before we found it." The return of Rebecca's voice. In 2021, a handwritten letter arrived at the Richmond Historical Society. No return address, no name, just one line on the envelope. "For the ones still listening." Inside was a photocopy of a journal page dated 1896. The handwriting matched that of Rebecca, the longest surviving Sullivan child. On the final page, she had written, "If this reaches you, then they've returned. They don't wear dresses or aprons anymore. They wear suits. They write grants. They say the word research instead of orphan. The silence is louder now than it ever was. But if you listen closely, the children are still crying." The Underground Network. By 2022, a group of independent journalists and researchers began quietly publishing what they believed to be modern Sullivan-linked sites. Each location had patterns, restricted access basements, records of unusually high food and medicine orders, children enrolled with incomplete identities, charitable organizations with no clear oversight. One facility in eastern Tennessee, registered as a trauma rehabilitation center, was raided after a whistleblower came forward. Inside were 13 minors, all undocumented. All told the same thing. We were told no one wanted us, that this was our forever home. The final ledger. And then came the break no one expected. An anonymous source leaked what appeared to be a digital ledger, a scanned document from 2003 containing encrypted names, dates, and transactions. At the top of the file was one word, Sullivanian. At the bottom, the circle, still drawn by hand. Analysts discovered that the ledger referenced several modern social service programs, all operating under different names in different states, but with similar language in their internal files. Phrases like candidate compliant, unit transferred, no family inquiry, continue conditioning. What frightened them most? Each facility had records dating back at least 20 years, and some had donor connections to powerful foundations and corporations. Who is running it now? No one knows. There is no Constance Sullivan, no Eleanor, no Mother Evelyn, but that may be the point, because today the network doesn't need a face. It uses systems, paperwork, legal loopholes, The machine has outgrown its maker, and somewhere deep in that system there are still children with no names. The unbroken circle. Rebecca once warned that evil adapts, that if it is not destroyed completely, it regenerates. And now, in this final chapter, the question is not, how did they do it back then? But rather, are they still doing it right now? We'll never know the full truth, because the Sullivan story was never just one farmhouse in Virginia. It was a blueprint, a method, a belief system that children without families are easier to hide. And in a world with systems designed to forget, silence can be more powerful than any lock or chain. The closing message. If you've stayed with us through all 10 parts, then you understand what most people don't, that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears kindness. It speaks softly. It offers help. It calls itself mother. And it lives not just in basements, but in systems that were never designed to protect the most vulnerable. So tonight, when the world is quiet and you hear a sound you can't quite place, ask yourself this: is it the wind, or are the children still crying from beneath the floorboards of time? The end.